The Cold War wasn't just fought in missile silos and secret laboratories. It was fought in classrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms, in the minds of millions of Americans who began to see treachery not in foreign capitals, but in their own neighborhoods. This is the story of the decade when fear became policy, patriotism became suspicion, and the United States, a nation built on freedom, began to turn inward. This is the story of the whispering fear. In 1945, victory had come at a staggering cost. The world lay in ruins, but the United States stood untouched, a new superpower armed not just with economic might, but with the most terrifying weapon ever created. For a brief moment, America seemed invincible. The war had united a fractured nation. Industry was booming, soldiers were returning home to new jobs, and optimism flowed through the suburbs like a newly opened highway. Families moved into brand new homes under clear skies of prosperity. There were white picket fences, shiny automobiles, televisions flickering with dreams of stability. And yet, beneath that shimmering surface, something restless stirred. The victory had come too easily, the peace too uncertain. For every headline celebrating prosperity, there was another warning of a new enemy, one not defeated on the battlefield, but lurking behind ideological lines. The Soviet Union had once been an ally. Now it was the embodiment of everything America defined itself against. In 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, erasing the United States' monopoly on nuclear power. The same year, China, with a quarter of the world's population, fell to communism. The post-war illusion of safety was shattered. The fear that once united America against fascism now turned inward. If the Soviets had spies capable of stealing the atomic secret, who could say where they'd strike next? In Washington? In Hollywood? In your child's classroom? This was the atmosphere in which fear became civic duty. President Harry Truman's 1947 Executive Order 9835 sounded like a simple bureaucratic measure, a way to ensure government employees were loyal to the United States. In reality, it marked the beginning of a national psychosis. Under the new Federal Employee Loyalty Program, more than 3 million government workers were investigated. Those found to have questionable associations, often meaning they had once joined a liberal organization or attended a meeting decades earlier, were dismissed. No trial, no charge, no appeal. The standard of guilt was no longer evidence, it was association. That word, association, became radioactive. People resigned from clubs, cut ties with old friends, and tore up books that might look suspicious. In the span of months, a quiet redefinition of citizenship had begun. To be a good American was not simply to obey the law, it was to prove your loyalty, every day, to everyone. Soon, states and cities copied the policy. Teachers, journalists, librarians, and even factory workers were required to sign loyalty oaths. College professors were forced to publicly renounce communist ideas, often under threat of dismissal. Some refused, and their names were quietly blacklisted. This was the new American contradiction, a free society obsessed with proving its freedom. By 1950, one man found a way to turn that contradiction into power. Senator Joseph Raymond McCarthy was not a prominent figure. He was known in Washington as brash, ambitious, and largely unremarkable. But he had an instinct for performance, and he understood that in an age of paranoia, outrage was currency. On February 9, 1950, speaking to a Republican women's club in Wheeling, West Virginia, McCarthy raised a sheet of paper and declared, "I have here in my hand a list of 205 names, known communists working and shaping policy in the State Department." There were no names. There was no list, but it didn't matter. Within days, newspapers across the country blazed with headlines, "Communists in the government." Radio talk shows buzzed. Citizens demanded answers. Senators scrambled to distance themselves from the accusation, or to ride its momentum. McCarthy had struck gold, not because he had evidence, but because he had found the perfect formula, the combination of fear and theater. From that moment, McCarthyism became more than a man. It became a movement, a style of politics defined by accusation without proof, loyalty as performance, and fear as justification. McCarthy turned the Senate chamber into a stage. Before cameras and crowded galleries, he interrogated diplomats, civil servants, and soldiers. The hearings were conducted less like trials than like moral inquests. He thundered questions, interrupted answers, and framed hesitation as guilt. The public, enthralled by the spectacle, tuned in. Newspapers printed transcripts as if they were serial dramas. Each day's headline fed the next day's fear. To be called before McCarthy was to be ruined, whether or not one was ever charged with anything. Careers evaporated overnight. Neighbors withdrew in silence. Former friends crossed the street rather than be seen with the accused. And in this climate of terror, the truth ceased to matter. The logic was circular. If you denied being a communist, you were hiding something. If you accused someone else, you might be lying to save yourself. If you stayed silent, that silence was suspicious. In this new moral order, innocence itself became unprovable. But McCarthy didn't act alone. Behind him stood J. Edgar Hoover, the iron-fisted director of the FBI, who had been waiting decades for a moment like this. Under his watch, the Bureau became a domestic intelligence empire, maintaining secret files on tens of thousands of citizens, politicians, civil rights leaders, journalists, actors, and professors. Hoover saw himself as America's moral guardian. His agents tapped phones, intercepted mail, and planted informants in universities and labor unions. Many of McCarthy's discoveries were quietly fed by FBI files, documents often built on rumor, innuendo, or anonymous tips. Meanwhile, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, targeted the entertainment industry. In 1947, it summoned 10 Hollywood screenwriters and directors to testify about their political beliefs. When they refused, citing their First Amendment rights, they were jailed for contempt of Congress. Upon release, they found themselves blacklisted, unable to find work in film or television. Studios, under pressure, circulated secret lists of unemployable names. Writers used pseudonyms. Actors fled to Europe. Careers built over decades vanished in months. The campaign against un-American influence extended to newspapers, universities, and even churches. Pastors who preached pacifism were accused of subversion. A student group that questioned segregation policies found its members under investigation. Fear was now the universal solvent. It dissolved everything it touched. By 1952, the whispering fear had penetrated every layer of American life. Loyalty oaths were required to teach kindergarten, to serve on a city council, even to drive a bus. Neighbors reported neighbors for strange behavior, reading Russian novels, attending peace rallies, subscribing to foreign magazines. Children learned duck and cover drills in the same classrooms where teachers whispered warnings about political correctness, long before the term meant anything cultural. The average citizen, far from the halls of power, was living a quiet psychological war. It was a war fought in conversations left unfinished, letters left unsent, opinions left unspoken. Friendships withered, marriages strained, families split over ideology. The most powerful country in the world had become afraid of itself. And all the while, McCarthy's influence grew. He chaired the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, giving him near-limitless reach into government agencies. Each hearing fed his myth of moral crusade, and each televised accusation cemented his public image as a defender of liberty. But behind the patriotic slogans and the flag-draped speeches, there was something darker, the exploitation of paranoia for power. McCarthy's brilliance was not in uncovering communists. It was in understanding that in a frightened nation, fear itself was enough. McCarthy's shadow stretched over every corner of public life, but power built on fear is fragile. In the spring of 1954, his crusade reached its breaking point. After years of attacking diplomats, journalists, and professors, McCarthy set his sights on a new target, the United States Army. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Army and McCarthy hearings were broadcast on live television, the first of their kind. For 36 days, the nation watched the senator's tactics exposed under the harsh light of unedited reality. His once thrilling aggression now seemed cruel, erratic, and desperate. He interrupted witnesses, twisted words, and insulted officers who had fought in the war that made him famous. Millions who had once feared him now saw a man intoxicated by his own authority. The turning point came in a single exchange. Army Counsel Joseph Welch, his voice trembling with exhaustion, looked directly at McCarthy and said, "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last?" The chamber fell silent. For a moment, even McCarthy seemed stunned. It was as if the entire country exhaled at once. That sentence, calm, weary, almost pleading, punctured years of hysteria. The spell was broken. By the end of that year, the Senate formally censured him. His influence collapsed overnight. The man who had once terrified Washington was suddenly avoided, pitied, forgotten. He died 3 years later at the age of 48, alone and disgraced. Yet while McCarthy himself vanished, the fear he exploited lingered like radiation after a blast, invisible, pervasive, and slow to fade. America had learned to mistrust itself. The reach of suspicion extended far beyond politics. Under Eisenhower's administration, the government expanded the security apparatus McCarthy had helped energize. Executive Order 10,450, signed in 1953, gave agencies sweeping authority to dismiss employees for anything deemed a security risk. The language was vague enough to include not only communists, but anyone who might be morally questionable. That ambiguity became the weapon of another campaign, the so-called Lavender Scare. Thousands of federal employees were fired or forced to resign because of their sexuality. Homosexuality was labeled a moral weakness and a national vulnerability, based on the belief that perverts, as the documents crudely stated, could be blackmailed by Soviet agents. The purge destroyed careers, ruined families, and pushed countless people into lifelong secrecy. Fear of exposure drove them into marriages of convenience or exile from public life. While McCarthy hunted Reds, others hunted those deemed different, proving that witch hunts rarely end where they begin. In the cultural sphere, the effects were equally profound. Hollywood continued to police itself long after HUAC had moved on. Studios hired clearance consultants to vet scripts for suspicious themes. Some films were rewritten entirely to remove social commentary. Writers who had once championed labor rights or racial equality learned to disguise their messages in allegory. The science fiction boom of the 1950s, stories of alien invasions and mind-controlling pods, mirrored the atmosphere of paranoia. The monsters on screen were metaphors for conformity, for the fear of infiltration, for neighbors who suddenly acted not quite themselves. Art became camouflage, coded resistance beneath the surface of entertainment. In universities, academic freedom shrank behind closed doors. Professors avoided controversial research or political discussion. History courses glossed over labor movements and socialist thought. Sociology departments rebranded radical ideas in sterile terminology. A single complaint from a parent or trustee could end a career. To survive, educators learned to self-censor, to teach without risk, to write without conviction. The classroom, once a laboratory of ideas, became another battleground of loyalty. Religion, too, was enlisted. Clergy who preached pacifism or questioned the arms race were accused of aiding the enemy. Sermons across the country warned of godless communism, equating faith with nationalism. Churches began flying the American flag beside the cross, blurring the line between spiritual devotion and political allegiance. Attendance soared, but belief became performative. People prayed as proof of loyalty. Even the simple act of staying home on Sunday could invite a raised eyebrow. The media, chastened by its complicity, slowly began to fight back. In 1954, journalist Edward R. Morrow dedicated an episode of his program, See It Now, to confronting McCarthy directly. His measured words cut deeper than any accusation. We cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. The broadcast marked one of the earliest examples of television used to challenge political power rather than echo it. For a moment, journalism rediscovered its conscience. But the scars of cowardice ran deep. Many editors admitted later that they had printed McCarthy's charges unverified out of fear, not fear of arrest, but fear of appearing unpatriotic. That admission revealed a quiet truth. Censorship imposed by terror doesn't need government orders. It only needs compliance. After McCarthy's fall, the machinery of fear did not disappear. It merely adapted. The loyalty programs remained. The FBI continued its surveillance, now turning its gaze towards civil rights leaders and anti-war activists. The playbook of suspicion, infiltration, guilt by association, the conflation of dissent with disloyalty, would be used again and again throughout the 1960s and 70s. The tactics of McCarthyism became institutional muscle memory. Every future controversy over national security, from Vietnam protests to the Red Scare's later echoes in the 1980s, bore its imprint. Yet even in the midst of repression, resistance endured. Blacklisted writers collaborated under pseudonyms. Scholars formed underground networks to preserve banned literature. Some who had been silenced during the hearings re-emerged as mentors for the counterculture generation, teaching skepticism as a civic duty. The children who had once crouched under their desks for nuclear attack drills grew up questioning the system that had taught them fear. The result was paradoxical. From enforced conformity came the seeds of rebellion. The same culture that once demanded silence eventually produced the movements that shattered it: civil rights, women's liberation, gay rights, anti-war activism. Each, in its own way, was a rejection of the 1950s commandment to keep your head down. The psychological damage, however, ran deeper than policy or politics. The McCarthy years had taught Americans to measure words before speaking, to filter thoughts before expressing them, to assume that someone might be listening. Decades later, sociologists would describe it as learned conformity, a national conditioning that outlasted the hearings themselves. People who lived through that era often spoke of it like a fever dream, the feeling that everyone was performing a version of themselves, pretending to believe, pretending not to notice, pretending to agree. It was the birth of what some called the smiling silence, the polite, fearful conformity of middle-class life in the atomic age. What made McCarthyism so powerful was not the scale of its victims, but the intimacy of its reach. It wasn't a distant tyranny imposed by a dictator. It was neighbors whispering about neighbors. It was bosses quietly firing employees who made them uneasy. It was the friend who stopped calling, the professor who withdrew a recommendation, the parent who told a child not to talk about politics at school. The terror wasn't in the arrests, there were relatively few, but in the erosion of trust. Democracy depends on conversation. McCarthyism taught a generation to hold its tongue. Even after the Senate's censure, McCarthy's rhetoric lingered in the airwaves. Politicians discovered that suspicion was a renewable resource. Campaign ads warned of subversives undermining the American way. Citizens groups organized to monitor libraries, demanding the removal of books that seemed sympathetic to socialist ideas. The phrase, un-American activities, entered everyday speech, used to describe anything unfamiliar, uncomfortable, or new. In the most ironic twist, the land of innovation began to fear imagination itself. Abroad, the Cold War raged on. The United States and the Soviet Union built arsenals capable of obliterating the planet several times over. Each side accused the other of hypocrisy and moral decay. Yet while missiles pointed outward, the real war, the one for the American soul, was fought within. The fear of communism became a mirror reflecting America's own anxieties about equality, freedom, and power. Every accusation of disloyalty was also a confession. A nation that doubted its citizens had begun to doubt its ideals. In hindsight, it's tempting to see the 1950s as an age of innocence, pastel colors, chrome diners, rock and roll. But beneath the nostalgia lies a quieter, darker memory. Families who lived through those years remember the tension in the air, the unspoken rules of conversation, the knowledge that an overheard word could ruin you. They remember burning letters, hiding books, teaching children never to answer questions from strangers about what their parents believed. They remember the silence after the radio announced another name, another career destroyed. The fear was invisible but omnipresent, like fallout drifting silently through the air, settling on everything. As the decades passed, America tried to forget. History textbooks condensed McCarthyism into a cautionary paragraph, a political scandal neatly resolved by decency. But for those who bore its mark, the experience never truly ended. The same mechanisms of suspicion would resurface in new forms. During the Vietnam War protests, when dissent was labeled un-American. During the Civil Rights era, when activists were accused of communist ties. During the War on Terror, when fear once again justified surveillance and secrecy. Each generation rediscovers how easily freedom can be traded for security, and how loudly fear can masquerade as patriotism. To understand McCarthyism is to understand that democracy's greatest threat rarely comes from external enemies. It comes from the corrosion of trust within. It's born when we allow accusation to replace dialogue, when we equate criticism with betrayal, when we value conformity over conscience. McCarthy didn't create that weakness, he revealed it. He simply held up a mirror and watched a frightened nation flinch at its reflection. The whispering fear did not vanish, it evolved. It learned to adapt to new technologies, new ideologies, new forms of media. Today, it echoes through social networks, through the churn of misinformation, through the ease with which outrage spreads faster than understanding. The tools are different, but the impulse is the same: to divide, to suspect, to silence. The ghosts of the 1950s still wander through our digital corridors, asking the same ancient question: who can you trust? And yet, there is another legacy, quieter but more enduring. Out of fear came vigilance. Out of silence came speech. The journalists who challenged McCarthy inspired a tradition of investigative reporting that still defends truth today. The blacklisted artists became mentors to new generations who refused to be silenced. The very people once branded as un-American became examples of what America at its best could be: courageous, questioning, unwilling to conform. When Edward R. Murrow ended his broadcast condemning McCarthy, he said, "We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty." That sentence, simple and calm, remains the antidote to every whispering fear that follows. For all its darkness, the era of McCarthyism left behind a warning written in history's margin. Freedom is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate what we say, what we believe, and who we become. As the Cold War receded and the Iron Curtain finally fell, Americans looked back at the 1950s with a mix of shame and relief. But the lesson remained clear. The danger is not that we will repeat McCarthy's words, it's that we might repeat his silence, his certainty, his belief that fear can purify a nation. The whispering fear is always waiting, patient and adaptable, ready to return whenever we forget how fragile trust really is. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more untold histories from the atomic age and beyond. And tell us in the comments, if you had lived in the 1950s, would you have spoken up or stayed silent? As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, America stood at a crossroads. The bomb shelters were still stocked, the air raid sirens still tested, and the memory of the whispering fear still lingered in the collective conscience. McCarthy was gone, but the system that had sustained him remained: the committees, the informants, the culture of suspicion. A nation built on individual freedom had quietly built a bureaucracy of paranoia. It was as if the United States had institutionalized its own anxiety. The Cold War had turned the country into both the warden and the prisoner, guarding against a threat that was as psychological as it was political. And while the Senate had censured McCarthy, the deeper question he posed, who can be trusted, had been absorbed into the bloodstream of American life. The decade that followed was one of contradictions. The same government that had demanded loyalty oaths now called upon its citizens to champion freedom around the world. The same schools that had taught children to duck and cover began teaching them to dream of the stars. The same media that had spread fear now celebrated progress. But the shadow of the Red Scare stretched across it all. It shaped foreign policy, justified interventions, and cemented a worldview that divided the planet into two irreconcilable halves: us and them. The whispering fear that once turned neighbors against each other now turned nations into enemies. Domestically, the aftershocks continued. J. Edgar Hoover remained in power for nearly 2 more decades, expanding his surveillance web far beyond communism. The FBI infiltrated civil rights groups, tracked journalists, and even monitored Martin Luther King Jr. under the pretext of national security. The methods were familiar: anonymous tips, guilt by association, the quiet erosion of privacy. The line between vigilance and violation blurred. Every protest, every act of dissent, was filtered through the logic of the McCarthy era, that questioning authority was the first step toward subversion. Meanwhile, the generation that had grown up in the shadow of the bomb began to question everything their parents had accepted. They had memorized the duck and cover drills, watched the newsreels warning of red infiltration, and seen the look in their parents' eyes when politics came up at dinner, that quick, frightened glance toward the window, just to make sure no one was listening. And now, as they came of age, they refused to live in fear. Their rebellion was not just against the government, but against the psychology of silence itself. The protests of the 1960s, for peace, for equality, for civil rights, were not born from chaos, but from memory. The whispering fear had taught them what conformity costs. The irony was profound. The same system that had tried to stamp out dissent had inadvertently created a generation allergic to obedience. From the ashes of censorship came a counterculture that demanded honesty at any price. The art, the music, the journalism of that era, all of it was a reaction to the decades of silence that preceded it. If the 1950s had been defined by conformity, the 1960s became a symphony of defiance. And yet, even as the young shouted in the streets, their elders carried the quiet scars of McCarthyism, the habit of second-guessing, the instinct to self-censor, the lingering fear that words could still destroy a life. In retrospect, the Red Scare seems almost inevitable. America's newfound power after the war had come with a moral burden, to lead, to protect, to define freedom itself. But power and fear are inseparable. The nuclear bomb had proven that progress could annihilate as easily as it could uplift. And so, the nation's optimism was always shadowed by anxiety, its prosperity haunted by paranoia. The whispering fear was never just about communism. It was about control. The need to believe that chaos could be managed, that ideology could be purified, that danger could be exorcised by naming it. In this sense, McCarthyism wasn't an aberration. It was a symptom of a deeper insecurity that runs through every empire at its height. The fear that strength might be an illusion. The same paranoia that fueled witch hunts in Salem, that drove crusades across oceans, that built walls and borders and empires. It reappeared in the atomic age with the same ancient language. Protect the faithful, expose the traitors, purify the world. The tools changed. The fear did not. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, America had long since buried Joseph McCarthy, but not the mindset he represented. During the Cold War, each new crisis, Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, resurrected fragments of that suspicion. Each wave of ideological conflict produced its own miniature McCarthyism, smaller in scale but identical in spirit. The language of loyalty, security, and purity remained irresistible because it offered simplicity in a world that had grown impossibly complex. And in times of fear, simplicity always wins. The legacy of McCarthyism is not preserved in monuments or museums. It lives in the questions we still ask when we're afraid. Who is loyal? Who is dangerous? Who can we blame? These are the questions that echo whenever a society confronts uncertainty. They reappear in new forms, in accusations of disloyalty during war, in conspiracy theories during pandemics, in public shaming on digital platforms. The whispering fear doesn't vanish, it adapts. It moves from courtroom to newsroom, from radio to television, from television to social media. The technology changes, but the psychology remains. Every generation invents its own version of McCarthyism, dressed in the language of its time. And yet, there is something redemptive in that repetition, because each time the whispering fear returns, it also meets resistance. Each time it rises, someone stands up and says what Joseph Welch once said, "Have you no sense of decency?" That question still has power, perhaps more now than ever. It reminds us that the defense of freedom doesn't always come from grand speeches or policies. Sometimes it comes from a single voice, trembling but unyielding, daring to speak when silence is safer. The Cold War ended, but its psychological architecture remains built into the foundation of American life. The belief in constant vigilance, the reflex to suspect before we understand, the ease with which fear becomes a unifying force, these are the invisible inheritances of the 1950s. We carry them not because we choose to, but because they were woven into the culture of safety and survival. They remind us that freedom is not a permanent condition. It must be renewed each time fear begins to whisper again. In the end, the story of McCarthyism is not just about politics. It's about psychology, about how fragile trust can be, and how quickly it collapses under pressure. It's about the way fear can seduce even good people into cruelty, and how power feeds on the belief that obedience is the same as virtue. The most chilling truth of that decade is not what the government did, but what ordinary citizens accepted. The committees, the oaths, the blacklists, none of it would have lasted without public consent. Fear works best when it feels like common sense. When we look back at the footage of McCarthy's hearings, the raised voices, the gavel strikes, the spectators shifting uncomfortably in their seats, we can almost hear the heartbeat of a nation realizing what it had become. The Cold War's great moral question was not whether democracy could survive nuclear weapons. It was whether it could survive its own distrust. And for a time, it almost didn't. But America endures not because it is fearless, but because it is capable of remembering. Each time the whispering fear returns, in new words, new screens, new disguises, the memory of what came before becomes its antidote. The journalists who refused to look away, the artists who kept creating, the ordinary people who refused to point fingers, they formed the quiet resistance that history too often forgets. Their courage doesn't shout, it whispers back. The whispering fear will always exist because fear itself is part of the human condition. But history offers a choice, to listen to it or to confront it. The Americans of the 1950s, trapped in the machinery of paranoia, chose silence because they believed it would keep them safe. Those who came after learned that silence is never safety, it is surrender. The challenge of every age is to choose differently. And so, as the reels of the past fade and the black and white images of McCarthy's hearings dissolve into static, we're left with a reflection that feels both distant and familiar. The microphones, the cameras, the headlines, they've all changed. The fear has not. It still waits patiently for the next crisis, the next demagogue, the next list of names. But so too does courage. The courage to speak, to question, to refuse the comfort of conformity. That is the real inheritance of the generation that lived through the whispering fear. The Cold War built bunkers to shield the body. McCarthyism built walls to shield the mind. Both promised safety and delivered anxiety. Both remind us that the greatest enemy of freedom is not the bomb, nor the spy, nor the foreign threat. It is the fear that convinces us to close our eyes. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Yesterday's Yield for more untold stories of the Cold War, and tell us in the comments below, if you lived in the 1950s, would you have spoken up or stayed silent?